We're talking to Tira Shubart. Could you start by telling us a little bit about your career to date?
I am a freelance journalist that's always been based in London, in the UK, and I've worked in 60 or 70 countries over the years. I mostly do broadcast and some print. I specialized for many years in Africa and the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Before that, as well as other various places. So I've covered a variety of stories that are all news, from elections to natural disasters to conflicts, and then sometimes just some really fun, light stories about conservation or something more cheerful.
Tira, what was it that got you into journalism in the first place?
I grew up in a family that was fascinated by politics. It was our daily conversation from when I was a tiny child. We have always traveled around the world from when, again, long before I could actually remember. So it was a natural thing to go into with my background. And journalists were always held in high regard in my family.
To date, are there any career highlights that really stand out?
There are news stories that I've talked to any journalist, and they particularly enjoyed being there and being a witness to history. So, for example, the revolutions of 1989, which was when the years of the superpower race between the West and the Soviet bloc all came to a head, and the Berlin Wall came tumbling down. And the revolutions of 89 caused regime changes across Eastern Europe. And I was in the middle of some of those, particularly in Bucharest in Romania. I also was babysitting the Moscow bureau of the broadcaster I was working for at the time in August 1991, when the coup against Gorbachev took place. And I had a front row seat on that, a lot of scoops on that story. And within 6 months, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. So that was another big highlight. Other stories involve working in Iran for off and on for about a decade, and then covering a number of wars in Iraq, and then covering a huge variety of stories in East Africa, South Africa. I was there for the release of Mandela from prison, and I was there for the funeral of Nelson Mandela and many points in between. So a few.
In terms of the day-to-day of journalism and your job, were there parts that you really enjoyed there or that you've always enjoyed?
I'm fascinated by news. I'm freelance, so I've worked for a variety of broadcasters as well as magazines and occasionally some newspapers. I like the process of news gathering. I like tight deadlines. I've done documentaries. I don't enjoy them as much as having a huge story break at 2 in the afternoon, and you have to get it on the news by 6 in the evening. To me, the shorter the deadline, the more pressure. It's the adrenaline rush of a big story and very little time to turn it around is just something I've always enjoyed.
And are there parts of that day-to-day that you didn't enjoy or that you really would have liked to change?
Um, I, no, I mean, no, I've really, and when you're freelance, if you don't enjoy it, you just move on to something else, and hopefully you're good enough to keep getting work. But no, there's the only thing I didn't enjoy was working on overnight on breakfast news. I've never enjoyed working on. I did that very briefly. And I really did not enjoy that at all. I don't think that it's humanly possible to enjoy staying up all night and then watching news first thing in the morning. No, didn't enjoy that one.
And in terms of what you write about and what you choose to write about, what are the themes that you generally go for?
Well, things that I can actually bring, that I can actually connect with an audience. So writing is different than broadcasting. Online writing on a breaking story, that's great fun. Because again, you have a few hours to pull something together and turn it around, and you have to give people a reason to go past that first paragraph or even read the first paragraph. Writing a feature article gives you a lot of time to explore the context, explore the background, and give the context. For example, I was up in Iceland at the end of COVID. Well, no, in the middle of COVID, and it was very interesting to explain why Iceland dealt with COVID so successfully, because it's a society that believes in science and genetic testing. And so that's a hard one to turn around in a 3.5 minute television news piece. And having longer, you can give a rather interesting background, and you can introduce characters and personalize it in a way that 3.5 minutes doesn't quite let you do.
For News Decoder, you've written quite a few articles for us over the years, and there seems to be a focus on space in quite a few of those and in international politics around space. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Space, I've always been fascinated by space. I've always been passionate about space since I was a child. And sadly, no one has asked me to be a journalist in space yet. I will happily accept any invitations. I find that looking at stories about space, it gives you a great perspective. There's different kinds of stories. There's stories about scientific exploration of our solar system, which I find fascinating, and cosmology, which is sort of essentially trying to work out the origins of the universe, which is I think a very soothing and fascinating topic. But as manned space flight is something that I'm particularly drawn to, and I think that many people are, because you have manned spaceflight began. It was kickstarted by the superpower rivalry between the then Soviet Union and the United States. And often those kind of rivalries speed up the development of technology, and they speed up projects that when they don't have a deadline, rather like trying to turn around a big news story by 6 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the evening. And so you have these great adventure stories of the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, and how the Soviets sent up Yuri Gagarin, a rather engaging man who sadly died far too young. And the Soviets beat the Americans into space by a matter of weeks. And of course, this culminates for many people like me in the Apollo missions, where man, and it was only men in those days, walked on the moon 6 times. And now we are approaching a second landing on the moon, which also, and so it's going to be men and women, and from different nationalities too. So that will be, we will see boots on the moon before the end of the decade. And the Chinese are in that race, and now we have 5 countries that have done what's called soft landings rather than crash landings of science missions on the moon. So the moon is the new hot spot for international rivalry, and we benefit very much by this. And lastly, the world is so dependent on space because of our lives are dependent on different kinds of satellites, communications and Earth observation satellites, and much more. That's why space fascinates me.
You mentioned there as well space rivalry and the idea of a space race and perhaps a new space race. But really, there's a lot in there about cooperation between nations too. So I think we hear rivalry and directly think conflict, rivalry. But can you talk to us a little bit about the cooperation that goes on?
The cooperation that goes on is very much exemplified by the International Space Station, and where astronauts and cosmonauts, same job, go and spend either 6 months or sometimes 12 months working on a orbiting space laboratory. It is about science, and it's a space station that's about the size of a football field and about the same space inside as a 6-bedroom house. So at any given point, you have an average of six people living and working in space. There's always some Russians, there's always some Americans, but I think that more than 30 nationalities have flown on the International Space Station. There's always a couple of Europeans, sometimes Japanese and Canadians, and they are doing hundreds, literally hundreds of experiments within each 6-month mission. And these experiments directly benefit us back on on planet Earth. They're about a lot of experiments about medicine, a lot of new technology about, for example, water purification. Because, for example, about 90% of all liquid on the space station is recycled and used as water, as drinking water. So that's a big percentage, and the kind of water purification that was developed on the International Space Station is now, for example, used in arid and semi-arid countries, for example, across Africa, to purify water from natural sources that may have become polluted. So a lot of science going on up there. It is a rotating, orbiting space lab.
Following on from that, why do you think that these topics are interesting for students, or how could they be interesting for students?
Well, there's a lot of very, in a world where there's often the news cycle presents a lot of negative news. And indeed, we haven't since the Second World War, we haven't lived in a time where there's been as many different conflicts going on around the world as there is right now, sadly. But if we look to space, on the whole, it's an example of cooperation, and cooperation in not just the International Space Station, but in other ways. Cooperation, nations build different scientific missions together. You have scientific missions that are going around the solar system. You have nations working together to gather very accurate space weather information. Space weather means keeping an eye on the sun, keeping an eye on solar flares, because anything that the sun does affects planet Earth. And if you have a very active solar cycle, as we're at the solar maximum right now, that affects our communication satellites, and it affects any of the 5,000 working satellites that are orbiting planet Earth right now are going to be affected in one way or the other by solar rays and what's called CMEs, the very big stuff, coronal, meaning the sun's coronal mass ejections of solar plasma can knock out satellites even. So we work together on many different things. I would imagine that when we have boots back on the moon, when there's human beings walking around on the moon, which will happen in this decade, and they'll be building a base, rather like we have bases at the South Pole, scientific bases. There will be bases that are built up on the moon, and they will do some very interesting science. But there will be a race for resources in space too, because there are rare earth elements and other resources on the moon that different nations may well want, and indeed they do want.
You mentioned the satellites there. Why are the satellites of use to us down here?
Nothing would happen without satellites. We wouldn't be able to have this conversation. You wouldn't be able to email your friends around the world. You wouldn't be able to WhatsApp other people. You wouldn't be able to have accurate weather reports. You wouldn't be able to stick your bank card into an ATM machine and pull out money. Weather reporting wouldn't happen without Earth observation satellites. Business transaction. If you're going to make a killing on the stock market, I haven't yet done that. All of that technology is relayed by satellites. If you are going to worry about your borders, if you're in a country where you want to have eyes on the border, and everybody does, that's done from satellites in space. If you want to get to a party and you need to punch in the address of somebody and you're looking at GPS, that only happens because of satellites in space. There's how does a ship, you've ordered something and it's coming on a ship from another country, and how does that ship get from point A to point B? Well, they use satellite navigation. So it's amazing how dependent we are on satellite technology.
And how something that seems so far away for some actually has huge impacts on our day-to-day lives.
And it's not very far. It's not very far. The International Space Station is 240 miles above us. That's 400 kilometers. So, I mean, that's the difference between driving from London to Liverpool. I wish instead of driving from London to Liverpool, I could just point my car straight up and go up and say hello to the International Space Station. It's not very far. But some satellites are as much as probably about 1,000 miles above Earth, about 1,500 kilometers. But all of that they're in low Earth orbit. They're relatively close to us. And those satellites can get knocked out by space weather. They can get knocked out by space debris crashing into them. And this is a big, big issue, space debris, which I've also written about. Everything that's orbiting the Earth is going at 17,000 miles an hour. That's 24,000 miles, 24,000 kilometers an hour, or 17,000 miles an hour. So if you have a tiny little a fleck of paint from a destroyed satellite, and that fleck of paint is traveling around at that speed, and you are doing a spacewalk in your spacesuit, repairing something on the International Space Station, that fleck of paint will go right through your spacesuit and you'll die. And something a little bit larger could hit a communication satellite and knock it out.
When you're writing about these topics, generally as you're researching, what kind of things do you learn while you're in that researching and writing process?
Whenever you're doing any research, you have to know what questions to ask. You have to ask the right questions. Otherwise, you just fall down a rabbit hole and you end up, reading everything and then remembering you should go back and watch another episode of Star Wars. I mean, any kind of research, you have to work out what you really need to know. And also, if you want to do interviews, which you usually do, who is going to be the best person to do that? So you have to ask the right questions and you have to be specific.
And how do you find the people that you want to speak to then, the experts to help you tell your stories?
You find interviews they've given, papers they've written. Sometimes it's very obvious. I wrote an article about right before Christmas about it was the anniversary of the great photograph that was taken by the American astronaut Bill Anders called Earthrise. He was taken when he was coming around an orbit around the moon, the first time man had ever gone into deep space in December 1968. And so obviously the person that one wanted information from was Bill Anders. So sometimes it's really obvious. Bill Anders, sadly, has just died about 4 weeks ago in a plane crash. He was piloting a plane at age 90. And so what a way to go for an astronaut.
What's the toughest part of writing or reporting a story?
You've just got to find the right way in. You have to find the right way into a story. And I train a lot of journalists nowadays because I've been around for, 100 years, it seems. And so the answer is, you've got to find the right way in. And once you do that, the rest of the story tends to naturally flow. And you have to have a strong beginning and a strong end and give people a reason for wanting to read or listen or watch. And you have to do that very, very quickly at the start of a story.
And if you had one tip then for young students or budding journalists, what would that one tip be?
Be a storyteller. It's as simple as that. Be a storyteller. And everybody grew up listening to nursery stories, to stories, the stories that you liked as a kid, and there was always something, it grabbed you right away. The stories that you remember are the ones that grab you right away. You ask a, a child to tell you a story, they will always start at a really interesting point. And then for some reason, we sometimes forget to be storytellers. Go back to basics. It's not that hard. Human beings are storytellers and have been since the beginning of time. So go back to basics. Don't be fancy. Tell a story that has a beginning and a middle and an end. And you don't even have to do it in that order. Start where it's interesting.
Well, Tira, we're going to wrap up there for today. So thank you so much for talking to us. And good
My
luck
pleasure.
with the rest of the stories and with training the next generation of journalists.
Well, I'm looking forward to them. We need some great journalists out there. There's many stories to tell, and I'm counting on them to save the world.
Thank you very much.